Hello, good evening. All right, tonight I am going to be discussing my opera history research paper, which is entitled Ideological Conflict Dilemma, Gregory Spears, Fellow Travelers, and the Christian Homosexual Male Identity in America. So I came up with this research just because I really wanted to do something with contemporary opera. I've absolutely been loving the kind of contemporary opera that I've seen lately. I've seen As One, I have seen Dead Man Walking, and a couple of other Jake Heggie operas such as Moby Dick. And I just really love the innovative things that are coming out, especially by companies such as like West Edge Opera, with newer operas that center around diversity in particular. So that is definitely one thing that is featured in Gregory Spears' Fellow Travelers. This opera was originally composed in 2016, given its premiere in Cincinnati, Ohio. And it's quickly gained a lot of critical acclaim all over the country. Gregory Spears is going to be actually writing an opera for the Metropolitan Opera. He's currently composing it for, I think, their 2021-2022 season, if I remember right. But he's a very popular composer right about now. So this opera takes place during Cold War era America, essentially. And what it deals with is, and what a lot of my paper centered around, was the idea of the homosexual Christian male identity. I think that those are three very, very distinct ideological concepts that are really pulled together within this opera, particularly in one of its main characters, Timothy Laughlin. So the opera takes place in Washington, D.C. between the years of 1953 and 1957. And it centers around these two main characters during what is called the Lavender Scare, which we'll talk about in just a minute. It centers around Timothy Laughlin, who is a young, recent college grad who has moved to Washington, D.C. from New York City to become a writer and work in politics, essentially. And then you have Hawkins Fuller, which is this State Department employee, essentially. He's this official. He's older than Timothy. Anyways, at the beginning of the opera, they come into contact and they meet. Now, they meet at this park, and Timothy essentially is reading this newspaper, and Hawkins starts talking to Timothy, and essentially you can definitely tell that Hawkins takes an interest in Timothy. And once they have kind of had this interaction, Hawkins puts Timothy up for this internship, this job. He puts in a word for him, which Timothy eventually gets the job as a speechwriter for a senator, Senator Potter. And from there, their relationship kind of buds. Timothy buys a book as a thank you to Hawkins, and then Hawkins shows up at Timothy's apartment, basically like, what's for dinner? And as from there, they have a night together, which they spend in ecstasy and making love. And from there, it continues to spiral. There's a lot of different things that take place during the opera, but that's essentially Act One. A little more happens where, so during the Lavender Scare, this is when the McCarthy era is like taking place, era of politics, and essentially what is happening, the Lavender Scare was a time in the US government when homosexuals were rooted out, not only homosexuals, but anyone that was really considered a security risk, which were particularly communist homosexuals and alcoholics. But the one that they could really prove more often, or at least they thought they could investigate and interrogate into finding out, was homosexuality. And so the opera really takes place during this time, and with these government officials. So Hawkins in the first act actually gets interrogated because one of his assistants kind of rats him out that he may be a homosexual. And so he goes through interrogation. Well, he ends up passing, and he's totally fine, doesn't get fired. But it does start to put a strain on the relationship that Timothy and Hawkins have sort of created for themselves. So Anyways, a few more things happen in the opera. Essentially, Hawkins upsets Timothy for a variety of reasons. Timothy realizes that Hawkins cannot provide the kind of relationship that he wants, which is marriage and a family and romance. Timothy ultimately understands that he can't have this because of the time that they're living in. But it's still hard for him to come to realize, because that's what he truly desires, is that intimate connection. Whereas Hawkins is much more of a physical character. He's more about the physicality of their relationship. So during the second half, Hawkins suggests having a three-way between another man and Timothy. And Timothy, ultimately, this is a really big breaking point, and he starts yelling at Hawkins, saying, "Get out, get out." And at this point, Timothy has been approached by a military recruiter, also in the mix of all of this, and decides to enlist in the army and goes across the sea to France. And so then a couple of the scenes take place between the two of them, kind of like writing letters back and forth. Timothy loves and misses Hawkins. Eventually they're reunited, and they have a moment where Hawkins has invited Timothy to this brick house in Washington that he has rented out for them to share for a little while. At the time, Hawkins has also been married, so that's also put a strain on their relationship. And anyways, they just come to realize that they really just can't be together. And in the end, Hawkins ends up betraying Timothy so that Timothy learns to hate Hawkins and leaves Washington, D.C. He betrays him by rooting him out as a homosexual, and Timothy is fired from his current governmental job that he's in, and so the two's relationship essentially ends right there. Musically and textually, this opera is just frickin' phenomenal. I absolutely love it. Gregory Spears' musical language is wonderfully stunning. It's a really big cross between American minimalism, as one of the sources said, as well as Baroque style, more neoclassical Stravinsky, and it kind of lives in this just very unique idiom that he has, and when you can listen to the music, you can really hear that. So the bulk of my research was kind of just relating information and analyzing the identity that Timothy was kind of struggling with, which is this homosexual Christian identity. Now, there's a lot of different moments within the opera that are kind of exemplary of this identity. One in particular is Timothy's aria, which he sings right after he's spent the first night with Hawkins. Timothy goes to a church essentially to confess and to pray upon what he believes is his sin. And so we're going to just take a little bit of a listen to it, and you can really hear the difference between the ecstasy that he is feeling and the emotional turmoil that he ends up feeling. But in the end, he ends up resolving this, saying, "Thank you, God, for giving him to me," which is just really beautiful and really poetic. So here's just a little bit of a taste of that music. So this is during that really that really emphatic moment that he's really having, where he is just fully coming to the realization of his sexuality truly. so he begins to kind of change over now musically. Right there. Mm-hmm. For the sake of time, I'm going to stop it right there. But then you could kind of get a little bit of a taste right there of that kind of turmoil that he's feeling underneath and that musical shift that it takes. And then it goes right back to that emotional feeling towards the end and kind of resolves the two together, which is really beautiful. And furthermore, there's other moments within the opera that also kind of have this religious homosexual male connotations. This identity all wrapped up in one another. And that is when another moment, most of it takes place when he's with Fuller Hawkins. So it turns out that every time they make love, Timothy takes off his cross that he wears around his neck. There's other moments, especially one very prolific moment when they're reunited in the brick house, and Timothy is telling Hawkins specifically about how when he was in France, he would go to a cathedral every morning and how he would confess one day and really explain that he just cannot stop thinking about Hawkins no matter how much he tries to forget about him. And it is just beautiful. And then he ends the whole thing with basically, I've never felt God more than what this brick house that we're in right now, which is just accumulation of all these different beautiful feelings that Timothy is feeling. And so a lot of my research, furthermore, after all this overview, went into kind of the psychology of this whole mentality. These are two very different dualities that are taking place, and a lot of this context is also made worse by the moment in time that this opera takes place, which is why it's so important to today, because it's very relatable still yet to today. The idea of a homosexual Christian, first, those two together, is one that is very contradictory to each other, based on society and based on a lot of people's emotions towards religion in particular, and basically because of what the Bible says and how people have interpreted that. And so it's very much a very dueling identity that Timothy has throughout this, which is really not one that's very much received in opera, number one, and number two, anywhere in art, period. So it's a really unique experience. It's a really unique character. And then when you put the concepts of masculinity and like being a breadwinner in the family at that time, and then kind of procreating being a very important aspect, having a family being very important to society in the 1950s, 1960s, that adds a whole nother layer to this character entirely. That is just really special. And you can see that there are so many conflicting factors underneath the surface of this whole character that are just really wonderful. And I think it's really prolific and really important in this moment in contemporary American opera that characters like this are seen and visible, because it gives a whole new meaning to diversity within opera, truly. And we're seeing characters really develop in just the last 10, 15 years that are not typical of most operas. And you have composers and directors taking operas that are older and then reshaping them in terms of contemporary society and changing characters kind of a little bit, changing their backstories or changing their beings a little bit, just shifting one aspect about them. And so a character like Timothy Laughlin is just incredibly prolific and important to the story of contemporary American opera right now. So if you ever get a chance, I highly recommend listening to the score of Fellow Travelers. It's available on Spotify, and you should definitely go check out the show. It's incredible. So thank you.